Okay, great. So this week's seminar, we have another very recent graduate, Christoph Renkl, who's going to talk to us about many things, but including windows of opportunity. So take it away, Christoph.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, today I'll be talking about downscaling the ocean response to the Madden-Julian Oscillation in the Northwest Atlantic. And that is part of my work that I've done during my PhD, which I defended not too long ago. So if you've been to my thesis defense, some of this might sound familiar, but today I'm going to talk more about the background and yeah, show a little bit more results than I was able to during my PhD defense. I will first cover a couple of key concepts that are necessary to understand the material, and then I dive into my actual work. So the coastal ocean has is of particular importance because that's where we grow our food. That's where we ship things from A to B, and that's where we also go to have fun at the beach. And all these things have in common that, yeah, we want to know as much as possible in advance the conditions of the ocean to, yeah, reduce risks that could be associated with extreme events like marine heat waves or storm surges that would make all the undertakings that require the coastal ocean a little more unpleasant. And before I'm going into the details, I'm going to make a huge leap going back to the 4th century, sort of talking about the history of weather and ocean prediction, which actually dates back to Aristotle, who wrote his Meteorologica in the 4th century before or BC, which was the oldest summary of the meteorological knowledge at the time. And around the same time, it was Pytheas that discovered that the ocean tides were controlled by the moon. However, it took then centuries or thousands of years to actually describe the environment mathematically. And that was in the 19th century when Navier and Stokes derived the governing equations describing the motion of fluids. In 1904, Bjerknes proposed that these Navier-Stokes equations could be used for weather predictions, given that the current state of the atmosphere is accurately known. And so in 1922, Richardson attempted to do that, and he discretized those equations by hand. You can see here on the right-hand side the grid over Europe, and try to solve it by hand. While his attempt failed, this is generally known to be the first or the foundation of numerical weather prediction. Then it took another almost 30 years for the first successful numerical weather forecast by Charney et al. To be delivered. And interestingly, this is only the first time, or around this time, when the meteorologists were able to predict their weather. Oceanographers only started to figuring out how the ocean works. And if you think about the Stommel 48 paper, where he figured out for the first time the Western intensification. So this just goes to show that the meteorologists were always a step ahead, and this is something that that keeps them going until today. In the 1960s, then the same set of equations was used to develop the first global ocean circulation model, which was part of a global coupled climate model. And nowadays, we have weather and ocean predictions at our fingertips with continuously improving models. But during the time, or back in the 60s, it was Lawrence and his assistants, Alan Fetter and Margaret Hamilton, who played around with the state-of-the-art weather models at the time then. And while Lawrence claimed all the fame for it, it's important to also know that the Alan Fetter and Margaret Hamilton, who actually did all the computations for him. And so by today's standard, they would actually be co-authors on many of his papers. And fun fact, Alan Fetter later married and took on the name Gill, and she's the mother of Sarah Gill, who is a professor at Scripps Institute, at the Scripps Institution. And Margaret Hamilton went on later to contribute computer code, which you can see here standing, where she's standing next to it. That's the computer code she contributed to the Apollo program that brought Neil Armstrong to the moon. So these three pioneers toyed around with a numerical weather model that was boiled down to 12 variables. And one day they decided to pick up on an older run and extend that in the future. And what they had done is they had written out the computer results down to the third decimal. However, their computer calculated the computations down to the sixth decimal. And so after coffee break, what they had, they came back after coffee break, and suddenly their solution had diverged completely from the initial run. They thought they had started from. And so this was the birth of chaos theory and also the research in predictability. This sensitivity to initial conditions is also known as a butterfly effect. And is essentially the foundation for today's ensemble weather prediction models. Later on, he used this models and postulated that the predictability limit of mid-latitude weather is about 2 weeks. And just to if you look at the predictability of the ocean, in contrast to that, they're generally longer because of the longer lead times, but it clearly depends on what process you're looking at. Like, for example, mesoscale eddies can be predicted up to a month, but anomalies due to the atmospheric forcing can only be predicted up to 2 weeks because they depend much on the predictability of the atmosphere. And then, for example, tides can theoretically be predicted indefinitely as long as you have sufficient observations. I guess I should at this point start and to define predictability. So when I talk about predictability, I mean the theoretical model-independent potential to predict a phenomenon. And clearly, as we've just seen, it is a function of the underlying physical process and can be influenced by many interactions across a variety of time and space scales. Now, you may ask yourself, okay, if weather is only predictable 2 weeks in advance, 2 weeks in advance, what can we do beyond this 2 week limit? What about climate projections, for example? And here it's important to note that the predictions on these time scales, we cannot make any statement about the individual state of the atmosphere, but rather about average conditions over a season or a decade or even a climate. And the predictability, instead of from the ocean, from the initial conditions as for the weather, here comes from low frequency processes and the teleconnections. So what it becomes a boundary value problem as opposed to an initial value problem. You can think of that, for example, our climate projections are primarily dependent on the future projections of greenhouse gases, and then the atmosphere reacts accordingly to that. One thing that has recently gained more attention is the time scale that sits between the weather and the climate time scale, and that's the so-called subseasonal to seasonal. I will refer to it the S2S prediction with lead times between 2 weeks and a season. You can see that here on the mark on the left-hand side of the graph. And because it sits between these two time scales, it's often called the bridge between weather and climate. And given that it's sitting in between, it makes it both an initial value, but also a boundary value problem. That's why it's only the last problem, so to speak, that's being tackled, because for the longest time, it wasn't clear how to get predictability on these timescales, because it depended both on the initial conditions of the model, but also on the large scale state of the atmosphere. The first subseasonal to seasonal forecasts date back to the 1980s. And since then, significant advances have been made by the atmospheric community. But the big question is, can we also predict the ocean on S-to-S timescales? One thing that the atmospheric scientists have found out is that the Madden-Julian Oscillation serves as a source of predictability on these subseasonal to seasonal timescales. What is the Madden-Julian Oscillation? The Madden-Julian Oscillation is an eastward propagating large-scale convective dipole near the equator that zips around along the equator with a period of 40 to 60 days. And it's been shown to be the primary driver of intra-seasonal climate variability. And furthermore, it's been shown that this large-scale convection associated with the MJO serves as a source for Rossby wave train. And this Rossby wave train propagates poleward and westward, and thus influences the mid-latitude circulation and weather. And this then creates a window of opportunity for S-to-S prediction of weather and maybe the ocean. What do I mean by window of opportunity? Well, if we have the Madden-Julian Oscillation here shown in this global view, and it acts as a source of Rossby waves, which has been shown to influence the mid-latitude weather shown here by the circulation, then the changed weather circulation over the North Atlantic, for example, should change also the ocean in return. And this is where my research comes into play. And more specifically, I want to know, can we use this to forecast the coastal ocean on subseasonal to seasonal timescales? And this is where downscaling, dynamical downscaling, comes into place, which is based on regional high-resolution ocean models that take large-scale information from global models along their lateral and surface boundaries. And often they also resolve additional processes in addition to their higher resolution. Like, for example, tides are often not resolved in global models, but are an essential ingredient in those regional models, especially if you think about our home waters here in the Bay of Fundy, for example. So my thesis and the research that I'm presenting today are the first step toward S-to-S prediction of the extratropical ocean. And specifically, I want to answer the question, does the MJO influence the North Atlantic surface ocean on S-to-S timescales? If so, what are the underlying physical processes? And then can we use that together with regional ocean models to reproduce the MJO, the response to the MJO, to eventually use it for S-to-S predictions of the coastal ocean? So in order to address the first question, does the MJO influence the North Atlantic surface ocean on S-to-S timescales? I'm looking at the response of North Atlantic sea surface temperature to the MJO. This is all observational based, so I'm using the NOAA Optimal Interpolation sea surface temperature dataset, which is a dataset of statistically interpolated satellite and in situ observations. And here I'm looking at bandpass filtered anomalies that have been from a seasonal cycle. The MJO is often characterized and is often characterized by the real-time multivariate MJO index, which also divides the state of the MJO into 8 phases, shown here in this phase diagram, which describe the position of this dipole anomaly of the MJO along the equator. And here I'm focusing in particular on phase 3, because this has been shown by the atmospheric people that for this phase, there's the strongest tailored connection between the tropics and our latitudes. The method I'm applying here is sort of a zero order statistical model or a composite analysis. And I'm looking at MJO episodes when the amplitude of the MJO is greater than 1 during winter. And then what I'm doing is I'm computing the conditional mean SST anomalies at different lags after a given MJO phase, in this case, MJO phase 3. And I assess the statistical significance using a bootstrapping method. What you can see here is the composites for 4 representative locations in the North Atlantic: the Scotian Shelf, on Georges Bank, Mid-Atlantic Bight, and Gulf of Mexico. What you can see on the y-axis is the lag after the MJOs in the phase 3, and on the x-axis is the lag, and on the y-axis is the mean or the conditional mean SST at these locations. And solid lines mean that the anomaly is statistically significant from 0 on the 10% significance level. What you can see is that while the MJO is in phase 3, so at lag 0, the SST is generally low or not significant, but with increasing lag, a positive anomaly occurs at all these locations with a slightly different lag between 20 and 25 days, depending on the location. So what that means is we have a first indication that the MJO is actually influencing the SST in the North Atlantic. If we now look at this in a little bit more spatial context, I'm essentially showing the same thing, but just for a map. So if you just focus on the first row, each map represents a snapshot for a certain lag after the MJO. I'm just showing the positive lag because we anticipate, or we expect the signal of the MJO to take a couple of days to actually arrive in the North Atlantic sector. So everything that happens while the MJO is in phase 3 is probably related to something that happened earlier. And if we go to the right, each panel, each panel corresponds to a lag, where the lag is chosen that 6 days roughly corresponds to the time the MJO spends in one phase. So as you can see, with increasing lag after phase 4, for example here, 24 days after phase 3, we see a significant widespread positive SST anomaly, especially in the Western North Atlantic, particularly in the Mid-Atlantic Bight and in the Gulf of Mexico, but also extending here into the Sargasso Sea. All this statistically insignificant composites have been masked out. And then what else you can see here is that along the diagonals, if you now go to phase 4, is that you see a similar pattern, but 18 days at a shorter time lag. And this just has to do with the quasi-periodicity of the MJO, where, as I said, the MJO spends approximately 6 days in each phase. So, and phase 4 comes after phase 3. So a lag of 18 days roughly corresponds to the same as 24 days after phase 3. So this obviously creates some ambiguity, which is hard to distinguish or hard to settle which phase actually causes this response. However, we know from the atmosphere that the strongest response occurs after phase 3. So from now on, I will mostly focus on phase 3. But if we now look at the opposite case, when the from phase 7, for example, when the dipole is flipped, then we see a response that is of opposite sign. So we actually have 2 phases that create a Taylor connection, or a strong Taylor connection, between the tropics and the North Atlantic region, which seem to influence the SST in a statistically significant way. To further, or one thing that you may have noticed is that most of these, even though they're speckled, these anomalies, the overall picture, it corresponds to large-scale anomalies and large-scale patterns, which kind of suggests that they're driven by the atmosphere. So to test that idea, I employed a statistical dynamical model for mixed layer temperatures, just shown here, and that's the only equation I'm showing today, which is a simple model that models the rate and change of the temperature anomaly as a function of the incoming net heat flux Q net divided by some coefficients and the mixed layer depth. And then this second term here is a decay term. So this together becomes an autoregressive model of order 1, which we can fit to our data. So as forcing, I'm using a bandpass filtered heat flux anomalies, and then I use an algorithm to estimate for each grid point individually the constant parameters of the mixed layer and this decay parameter lambda. And then with the best parameters, I can predict the SST anomalies and do the same compositing analysis again. And what I'm showing here is, again, after phase 3. On the left-hand side, you see the panel I've showed before from the SST observations. And on the right-hand side is the result of the composited mixed layer model output, that the pattern are largely comparable. The only problem is that the heat flux data are only available on a much coarser grid, and that's why we don't get this small scale structure. But overall, if you compare this large scale pattern of the SST, if you sort of took away these, or if you include the statistically insignificant areas, that would mostly be red, and there's a very high correspondence between these two patterns, which kind of shows us that these SST anomalies linked that we see in response to the MJO are driven by the atmosphere and mediated by the heat fluxes. So what does this, or how does it all tie together? And this is where we go back to the physical mechanism and sort of look back at the Rossby wave train that is induced by the MJO in the tropics, and here illustrated by the anomalies of the 500 hectopascal geopotential, sort of propagating from the source region of the MJO, shown here by the outgoing long wave radiation. As we can, so now I'm flipping forward in time. This is this figure shows the Rossby wave train during the time when the MJO is in phase 3, and then I'm now flipping through and increase the time lag. And what you'll see is that in the North Atlantic, I'm plotting the resulting net heat flux anomalies. And you can see that with increasing lag, we see a change in the heat fluxes there. And these can be related to the lagged atmospheric response to the MJO, which lead to an advection of air masses that change the sensible and latent heat flux in the area, which then in turn change the SST. So this shows us that the MJO can provide us a temporal window of opportunity for S2S predictions of the ocean, and which we can now utilize to see if we can make predictions of the ocean, on a regional scale. To do that, I'm using the Gulf of Maine Scotian Shelf model, or GOMS model, developed by Anna Katavuta. Here are just the model specs. I'm not going through them, but if you're interested in them, we can chat about them at some point. And just one side note on the model validation. This model has undergone extensive validation, and Anna has shown that GOMS has useful skill. And my thesis, I added to the validation using new sea level records by tide gauges, which are referenced to the geoid. And just as a little teaser, I'm not going to talk about that today. These observations can also be used to monitor upwelling average over the nearshore region. I'm happy to talk about that at another time. But for now, all you have to take away from this is GOMS is able to predict the regional circulation very well and can thus be used for our downscaling experiments. In my work, I was using, I applied a case study analysis where I used the validated GOMS model. And for these case studies, I decomposed the model forcing into 4 different frequency bands. There's the F bar is the climatology, which is just the seasonal cycle. F prime is the high frequency atmospheric forcing, so that's related to wind and others, or wind events and storms that pass through the model domain. Then we have tidal forcing, and then this F hat is the forcing on S timescales, which I designed in a way that they represent the MJO composites. So I used both the forcing at the lateral boundaries and created the same composites as I did for the SST observations, and also for the surface forcing, and prescribed them as the model. And by including or leaving this term out, I can assess the difference to the MJO, or I can sort of look at the sensitivity of the model to this additional forcing on S2S timescales. But before I show that, I quickly want to show you the mean conditions on the Scotian shelves and highlight the importance of including the high frequency atmospheric forcing, the term FA prime. So what you can see here, these are the mean hydrographic conditions along the Scotian shelf section just off Halifax. So Halifax would be here at 0, and then you can see the shelf break at around 200 kilometers away from the coast. And what you can see is that including the high frequency atmospheric forcing, we get a well-defined mixed layer at about 60 to 80 meters. We have a well-defined Nova Scotia current here, which is separated from the rest of from the shelf by the density front. So this looks all good and agrees well with observations. But leaving the term FA out, we do not get this mixed layer, and we get a strong stratification and sort of a bleeded out Nova Scotia current here near the coast. So this just goes to show that even though we are interested in a sub-seasonal to seasonal average conditions, we still have to include high frequency forcing to get the overall statistics right. Okay, now let's have a look at the predictions of the SST response of GOMS in response to the MJO forcing. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you the observations, and on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the difference between a model run, including the MJO forcing for phase 3, minus the reference run, which doesn't include the F hat forcing. And these are all referenced, and here the observations are referenced to the difference at 0 lag. So they're slightly different than the ones I showed before, but this way they're more comparable to the model output. So as we go forward in time, we can see that the same positive SST anomaly that we observe on the left panel, we're also able to predict that with the model, which then later on starts to decay. But what we can also see is that in addition to this large scale warming over the shelf, we get the advantage of the high resolution model of lots of small scale features. And with the model itself, another advantage of the model is that we are not restricted to the surface. We can also look what's happening at depth. And that's what I'm showing here. Again, here's now I'm showing you the predicted temperature and salinity anomalies along that section. So at 6 days after MJO phase 3, there are already small differences visible. And if we step further in time, these actually enhance. But you can also see that the surface forcing, the large scale surface forcing is actually extending all the way through the mixed layer. And one other thing you can see is that along the density section, or we see a strong temperature and salinity anomaly along the density gradient that separates the Nova Scotia current. So this just goes to show that there is some advection going on that pushes this density from back towards and back from the coast. And one thing that is hard to see from this section is that actually there's also some anomalous upwelling happening near the coast. And to show that in a better way, I'm now showing the bottom salinity after phase 3 on the left hand in the left panel, and after phase 7 on the right hand panel again. And I'm going to flip again forward in time. So 6 days. If you remember from the section along the Scotian Shelf, we have fresh and we have fresh water at the top and salty water at the bottom. So what happens here is that with the wind being almost parallel or in sort of parallel direction to the coast, we get classic downwelling, and the fresher water from the surface reaches a greater depth, which can be seen here along the coast. After phase 7, where the wind is sort of opposite or somewhat in the opposite direction, we get the opposite response. This just goes to show again that these two phases of the MJO create opposite responses. If we flip through, or if we go forward in time now, we see that that this upwelling, or this anomalous upwelling and downwelling enhances. And later on, if we further increase the lag, actually switches into upwelling here after 30 days after phase 3 and 30 days after phase 7. So phase 7 again is half a cycle later of the MJO, and 30 days is approximately the time it takes through half the cycle. So this picture is this time is similar to a shorter time lag after phase 3 actually. So that's where this similarity comes. And this is actually quite interesting, because if we think about it, if we recognize that that the MJO has an influence on the upwelling, that means that we can that potentially the biological processes on the shelf might be affected and potentially be predictable on subseasonal to seasonal timescales, which remains to be explored. Just to conclude here, I hope I haven't gone too much over time. I'm presenting here the first steps toward S2S prediction of the extratropical oceans, and I'm now going back to the questions that I raised at the beginning or halfway through my talk. Does the MJO influence the North Atlantic surface on S2S timescales? I've shown that a statistically significant and spatially coherent SST signal exists in the North Atlantic, which co-varies with the MJO, which shows that the MJO is a source of predictability on S2S timescales for the extratropical ocean. And this then in turn creates a temporal window of opportunity, which will eventually enable us to have more accurate S2S predictions of the ocean. What are the underlying physical processes? I think I've demonstrated, or there's strong evidence that the North Atlantic variability on S2S timescales is driven by the atmosphere in response to the MJO. And this response results in changes in heat fluxes that lead to these SST anomalies. Then the last question was, can we use a regional ocean model to reproduce the response to the MJO? And using the GOMS model, I showed that high resolution ocean models are able to capture the large scale response to the MJO. And they can also add some more value by giving us information about changes on smaller scales and at depth. And this overall highlights the feasibility and the value of downscaling global S2S predictions. Just to talk about the next steps where this work could go is, now that we've shown that it's generally feasible to use these regional models for S2S predictions, we can use global S2S predictions from coupled ensemble systems and downscale them to actually go away from the case studies that I presented to downscale actual S2S predictions. These can then help to assess the predictability of ocean extremes, and also further, we can explore possible influence on biological processes on S2S timescales. With that, I just quickly like to thank those people who have contributed here and are listed here. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Keith for his patience and encouragement and all the support over the years. And of course, my advisory committee and as well as collaborators. And I'm happy to take any question.
Great, thanks a lot, Christoph. Are there any questions out there? Just jump in, just unmute yourself and ask them. You've stunned them all, Christoph. Dan's got one.
I wonder, first off, elegant and very interesting talk. So thanks so much for the clarity of it. Could you maybe go to slide 15, I think it was?
15. Hope this works. I'll just do it hopefully.
It was a map sort of thing. Okay, so it was that one.
This one, yeah.
No, it must have been a different 15. If you could go down slowly, it was a map.
Okay.
That one.
Okay.
So by 15, I guess I mean 16. I got my wrong glasses on. Anyway, over on the right-hand side, there's lots of really interesting stuff going on south of, it's called Yarmouth, that tip of Nova Scotia there.
Yeah, just for clarity, this.
Yeah. And so in this one, there's Banded, and later on there was other stuff. What's special about that place?
So I know that there's lots of topographic upwelling happening too. So I wonder if the interaction with the wind and the mean flow there would actually cause some, would influence that upwelling in that region. I haven't really looked at that. I've certainly seen it. I focus more on what's happening along the coast with the shift of the Nova Scotia current and the upwelling and downwelling there. But if I had to guess, then it would be related to some interaction, some change in the tidally driven mean upwelling there.
Yeah, I know people have thought about that around there. Maybe if you could just go to the next slide, because I think you had some slides which showed, yeah, that one. So all kinds of stuff is going on down there and everywhere. I mean, I agree, the whole place is interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. And I didn't attend your thesis defense, so I really appreciate the fact that you gave a seminar here so that people could see your work. It's been great. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
All right, anyone else out there with a question? Oh, I believe Christoph's also available at the Thursday coffee for questions as well. So
Right.
You can find him there, find him by email. So yeah, thanks again, Christoph. Great
Thanks,
presentation.
Dave. Yeah.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks for another seminar.